This is the Spurscast with your host, Paul Garcia.
And welcome back to another episode of the Spurscast. In today's episode, I'll be joined by Project Spurs writer Collin Reid, where we'll discuss teams with trade player exceptions, the latest trade rumors, and the Spurs in their last 4 games. Let's go ahead and jump right into this episode with Collin. Collin, you were on here about 2 weeks ago. How have you been?
Yeah, pretty good. It's kind of that time of the year where basketball itself is kind of steadying out and we're getting into kind of transaction season. We have trade and then All-Star and then, only March and then all of a sudden the playoffs start. So it's kind of like the basketball portion is kind of steadying out, but we have a lot of exciting stuff on the calendar coming up.
Man, normally January is like that time where things get a little slow, in the basketball world. And, just the games are kind of just there. They're just there on the schedule. But man, that game on, Monday evening in Philly where Embiid went for 70. Oh my, that was just, wow. That was something to watch there. All right. So we're going to talk about that game a little bit later here, but let's first begin with one of the topics I had told Spurscast listeners I really wanted to dive into. And I finally had some time to do that. And that was the trade player exceptions that other teams have. And I was really seeing, whether the contracts of Doug McDermott or Cedi Osman could be, absorbed into one of these trade player exceptions from different teams. So what I did over the weekend was I really, I basically got all my cap sheets accurately. I did as many transactions to figure out basically where everybody was cap wise. I figured out exactly where the TPEs are, and then of course on on Tuesday that we're recording the Hornets and the Heat, two teams that one of the teams I'm going to talk about. They make a trade for Terry Rozier to the Heat, but luckily for us, it doesn't impact their cap sheet too much. They actually open up some room for themselves under the tax. So what we're going to first begin with is I'm going to list some teams for you where I couldn't find a good reason why these teams should trade for either Doug McDermott or Cedi Osman. And it could be for a multiple number of reasons. It could be that maybe there wasn't enough roster space. They're already capped out at 15 players on the roster. Maybe adding Cedi or Doug could put them over the tax or maybe even further into the second apron or first apron. It could be that they're a rebuilding team. So there's just a multiple good. I just couldn't find a good case. So I'm going to tell you those teams first. And if you're intrigued by any of them for me to tell you their case, let me know. So there's the Atlanta Hawks who have a $23 million trade exception. The Brooklyn Nets have a 19, 18 and $6.8 million trade exception. So basically, the Hawks and the Nets could fit in Doug's contract. The Nets could fit in or Cedi's contracts. The Bulls have a $10.2 million disabled player exception, which can be used to almost like a trade exception to acquire a player in a trade. The Memphis Grizzlies have a $7.4 million trade exception, which could fit Cedi's contract. The Trailblazers have an $8.7 and $8.3 million trade exception that could fit Cedi's contract. And then the Raptors have a $10 million trade exception, and the Wizards have a $12 million trade exception, which could both of those could fit Cedi's contract. So again, these are I have my reasons why I don't think any of these teams would make a trade for either Doug or Cedi. Do you want me to expound any further, or do you agree with those teams that I listed?
I think so. I mean, because I'm not quite sure just off the top of my head which ones are like tax reasons or this kind of stuff. But for me, a lot of those situations are like, I think the best situation for these teams are going to be like high level contending teams or playoff teams where they have a hole in the rotation that these players are going to fit. I don't know how much sense it makes for like Brooklyn, who's even maybe like in a middle tier of the NBA. Like what kind of sense does it make for them to get Cedi, or like what kind of sense does it make for Memphis or Toronto to get Cedi? So no, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of what you're looking for. Is you're looking for more contender type teams. Plus, they got to have those second round picks available, and that's one issue that I also found as I was going through some of these teams. Okay, so again, those are the teams that probably you can't really make a strong case for. Again, I don't see them making a trade for Cedi or for Doug McDermott. So these next three teams, I do see a possible Cedi trade. Just kind of opening the door, just looking at these teams. Now, for these three teams I'm about to name, Doug McDermott's salary would not fit in either of these three teams' trade exceptions. So let's first begin with the Miami Heat. They have a $9.4 million trade exception and a $7.2 million trade exception. So either of those trade exceptions could be used to absorb Cedi's contract. So let's look at some of the positives why I think this could happen, and then the negatives why it may not. For one, let's see here. They do have one open roster spot, so they don't have to waive a player or trade a player. So there are 14 players on their roster. They're with this new deal for Rozier. they're currently $9 million below the second apron, which means if they added Cedi, yes, they'd still be a tax team, which they already are, but they'd still be about $2.3 million shy of that second apron. So they're still kind of where they are, and even with adding Cedi. So financially, yes, it puts on a little bit more on their salary sheet, his contract, but not as much. They also have, they have some players there at the wing position. They got Jimmy Butler, they got Jaime Jaquez Jr., and they have the Martin brother. Is it Caleb or Cody? One of the Martin brothers.
I think it's Cody there.
Cody, okay, so
I think so.
one of the Martin
Yeah.
brothers there. So they have some depth there, but we do know that like Jimmy Butler's, he always sits out games. He's hurt a lot. The same thing for Caleb Martin or Cody Martin. So again, they could use some depth there with Cedi, going forward as the season ends. Plus, I think he could also have a chance of cracking their playoff rotation. The one negative for them in terms of giving the Spurs an asset back, a second round pick, is that they don't really have their own second round picks going forward. They have a lot of picks that have different protections, or if this happens, that happens. Those kind of trade scenarios. They made a lot of different transactions over the last few years. So that's first the Heat. Now let's look at the Knicks, why I think we could maybe and maybe not build a case for them. The Knicks also, they have a $6.8 million trade exception, which does fit Cedi's contract. They have one open roster spot as well. So again, 14 players on their roster, which means they have one open spot. This deal, one negative is that it would put them into the tax. But we do know the Knicks are a team that are trying to win. I mean, they're what, 4 or 5 seed in the East. They do have some depth there, more I would say smaller players there, more at the wing, such as like OG Anunoby. They just traded for Josh Hart, Dante DiVincenzo. They could use a little bit more size. They could add some size, and then they do have some of their second round picks. So that's actually a positive for them, as they have a few second rounders available. And now let me get to the third team, and then I'll let you just kind of get your thoughts here. The last team is Philly. In their category, I said probably no, but let's at least listen kind of thing here. So they also have a $6.8 million trade exception, which would fit Cedi's contract. They don't have roster space right now. They're maxed out at 15 players. So again, that's one negative for Philly. They are $2.4 million under the first apron, so adding Cedi would put them over the first apron. They do have picks wise, they do have some future seconds, and then they have some depth there at the 3-4. They have Nick Batum, they have Kelly Oubre Jr., they have Tobias Harris. Even though he doesn't play, they also have Robert Covington as well. So they have a number of options there at the wing. So just kind of give me your thoughts. Do any of those three teams intrigue you in terms of trying to possibly make a trade for Cedi?
So I think the big holdup with the Heat being the assets they send back, I do think is a real holdup. I think when we started talking about these teams, that was one that kind of came to mind immediately. You have a toolsy wing who, if he's willing to buy into like their training program and their system, you could see something ridiculous happening where one of the wings in the rotation gets hurt in a playoff series and Cedi comes in and gives you 30 minutes of solid playing that wins them a playoff game. Like, that's the Miami Heat. And I think the thing I like about them best out of the three of the teams you mentioned was, in my mind, while Cedi is good and I think he can fit a rotation spot, if I were in a front office, he's not the kind of player I'd be going over a threshold, whether that's the first apron or the tax or anything like that. I don't know if I'd be going over that threshold just for Cedi. So let's say the Knicks make a move, they make another move where they're becoming more competitive, they're bringing in a good bit of talent, and that puts them over the tax, then maybe you start looking at Cedi, right? But like, if it's just strictly we're not in the tax and now we're going to be, I just think the way that teams operate, I don't know, because you're paying kind of twice at that point. You're paying what you're sending out, and also you're paying the tax. So, and then the same is true with the first apron for Philly. Especially just kind of, they have a little bit more of a glut of wing talent, like you said there. So to me, the Heat make the most sense, but that would almost be, and I'm not foreseeing this happening, but that would almost be more of like a buyout situation, which you can't use a TPE on, because, the Spurs, if you are trading, the Spurs aren't going to just take nothing back for him, and especially for the fact that, and Doug is as well, but like Cedi is like a rotation player. You kind of want something in return for a rotation player. You don't want to just like trade that out and not have anything to fill that when you're taking the court, even if it's just some picks or something.
Okay. Yeah, I think again, I wasn't really strong on either of these three options, but again, if I felt like there was the best option, I think Miami has the best case. Like you made a great point there about Philly and New York not crossing the aprons to just to add a player like Cedi. And then one thing we do want to comment too is that these are just trade player exceptions and disabled player exceptions. We're not. I haven't even looked at like player for player kind of trades. There are some other deals that contenders could make with the Spurs to try to figure out maybe how to acquire Doug or Cedi. Again, just using more so using the players. This is just something that I want to explore is kind of who fits there in those TPEs from different teams. And so, like I said, there's not really a lot of options there. This is kind of something that I explored early on in the preseason when the Spurs were over the contract limit, or they had a number of players that they had to waive or trade. And so that was something that I've kind of explored. It's kind of the same scenario, even just a few months later. All right, so now for our next topic, let's talk about just the latest trade rumor mill update. So there hasn't been a lot lately in the last week since the last recorded Spurscast episode. It's kind of been some of the same topics. Mainly Dejounte Murray has been mentioned still. So there's just some new updates on him. So I'll go through those rumors. So regarding Dejounte, Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype recently had an article where he reported that the Hawks aren't looking to take back salary past the season in a Murray trade. So that's interesting because that's something that we talked about is, what if the Hawks want, a player like Keldon Johnson, a really good young player, quality player. So that's why I was like, oh, maybe like Doug McDermott's salary and Cedi's salary, or like Devonte Graham's salary and Cedi's contract, figure out a deal for the Spurs and Hawks. So those kind of deals would work. But then just recently, I think it was on Monday morning, Chris Haynes of Bleacher Report, he was on a podcast with Mark Stein. And then Haynes reported, though, that yes, Atlanta wants 2 first-round picks for Murray, but also a quality player. So then it's like, if that's the case, they probably, Keldon probably ends up being a player there that Atlanta might look at. And then regarding Devonte Graham, he was mentioned in some reporting. According to Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports, he mentioned that Graham is available in trade discussions from what he's heard. And this is basically very obvious. We know that Graham hasn't been part of the Spurs' rotation at all this year. He has a $12.1 million contract this season, and the next year he has a $12.6 million contract, but only 2.8 is guaranteed. So I think it's just it's just obvious to have Devonte in trade rumors, considering that he's not even in the Spurs' rotation. What are your thoughts on that Murray, those latest two Murray rumors?
Yeah, so just the Devonte Graham one real quick, because I can knock that out pretty fast. I think that if I were a rival team and I felt like he could bolster my point guard rotation or my guard rotation, I might not put my most competitive offer forward because, like you just said, he's completely out of the rotation. They owe him $12 million this year, and while he is under contract for next year, it's only $2 million guaranteed. Like, that is a buyout candidate if I've ever heard one. If I were another team, I would probably kind of see if I could gauge the market, and if there is none, I would just wait and see how that buyout goes. Because if he's completely, a lot of the times when a player wants to play and they're not in the rotation and they're not, like, the Spurs have accommodated them.
Yes.
So I don't know how he feels. This is more of a report that the Spurs are willing to move on from him. It doesn't really talk about how he himself is viewing the situation, but I would view him as a pretty prime buyout candidate. So with Dejounte, I think that we're getting into the sunk cost fallacy a little bit here. I think that Atlanta, they want to win the PR battle. They want to win the press conference. I think they're a little bit afraid because they just traded for Dejounte like 18 months ago or so. And now I think they're concerned of what it's going to look like if they don't get the same return back. I think even yesterday or the day before, Woj had a quote that was something along the lines of, like, the Hawks want to live in a world where they get a similar return back for Dejounte with what they gave up, or something like that. He phrased it in a way that basically was like, they're being a little bit delusional about it right now. Like, they're not going to get what they gave up for him. And I think what's interesting to me is this posturing is coming after, because, like, I understand they want to reset. I understand they want to pivot and go in a new direction, but there's nothing forcing them to do that by the trade deadline in terms of moving Murray. And yet, when we last talked, and even since then, the reporting is very strong that they're, like, I would be shocked if he was a Hawk after February 8th. So like, now all of a sudden, you showed your hand, which is like, we are definitely going to trade this guy. And now you have to build up some leverage, because, like, if I'm the Lakers, I'm saying, like, well, if I'm the only team offering you D'Angelo Russell and a first and then kind of a fake first, and no one else is getting close to that, like, why are you saying no to me if you're going to have to trade him by the trade deadline? So I feel like some of this is posturing.
Mhm.
And I do think, even though I don't think he's going to end up on the Spurs, I do think the fact that they are desperate to move him is what does open the window for the Spurs to kind of swoop in there with something like, kind of like how I just said the Lakers trade. It was going to be, D'Angelo Russell a first and then maybe like a swap or something. I think that they're probably going to get to a point where a quality rotation player plus a first plus like a fake first, like Charlotte, the Charlotte first that the Spurs own, something like that. That's probably going to become the price before this is all said and done. I think that they're just kind of stuck now backpedaling and doing some posturing because they artificially drove down the market with the way that they've been so desperate to move on from him. So yeah, I think that's interesting that reporting has come out. I don't foresee them. I think whatever the trade is, people are going to kind of clown on them a bit for the difference between what it costs to get them, and like that's just it's already done, so they can't really think about that. They just have to do the best trade they can. But I think right now they're just posturing, in my opinion.
Okay, I like what you said there. I think also regarding the Spurs, it's like they're kind of just waiting to sit back and see, like you said, they can kind of swoop in because there are more teams being mentioned almost daily. Like we got the Milwaukee Bucks now in the conversations. You got the Brooklyn Nets. There's just a bunch of different teams that have been added to this conversation. But as I look away from afar, you just know that the Spurs have the best. They can put together the best trade package. Again, they won't send that best trade package, but maybe they'll see whatever like Atlanta's about to decide on and say, okay, we can beat that with this. And so because they have all, they have the draft capital or even they have some of the players if that Atlanta might want. So again, I think for San Antonio, like you're right, maybe they're not going to be super aggressive in trying to land Dejounte, but if there's a good opportunity available, then I think that like you said, they might swoop in and try and get a little bit more aggressive there. Regarding Dejounte, and again, that's kind of where the trade discussions lie at this point. Again, we're about 2 weeks out from the trade deadline, so again, we'll continue to see if more rumors come out in these next 2 weeks. All right, so our last topic, Colin, let's actually talk about the basketball games here. The last 4 games for the Spurs. They did get a win, so that's one of the good. That's one good positive. So let's go back to last Wednesday. They were on the road at Boston. They ended up losing by 19 points. They were close for about the first quarter, but then Boston took control in the next 3 quarters. Boston led by as much as 30. The Spurs did fight back a little bit. Wemby ends up with 27 points in 27 minutes. Then on Friday, the Spurs are at Charlotte last week. They ended up losing by 4. There was no Wemby. He was out again due to rest. This was a close game throughout. Charlotte led by 12 at the end of the third quarter. The Spurs fought back. They got the game within crunch time, but they couldn't make the full comeback. And so the Charlotte ends up winning. Keldon had a great night that night with 25 points off the bench. Then on Saturday, the second night of a back-to-back on the road at Washington, the Spurs get a 4-point win. It was a very close game throughout. Washington ends up taking a 12-point lead with 5 minutes on the clock, and I thought this game was over. Like I was like about to start getting ready to type my, the Spurs or blah 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 when they lose this many games. So I was like getting ready to start typing out those stats. No, the Spurs, they make that comeback in the final 5 minutes. They get the stops that they need. They make the plays that they need to, and they end up winning by 4 points. Wemby had an incredible game with 24 points, 6 blocks in just 28 minutes, and then the historic night on Monday in Philly. The Spurs lose by 10. It's a close game for about a half. Then in the second half, Philly kind of pulls away. They end up going up by double digits. Wemby has a 33-point night, which is like, it's really good. It's his second highest scoring night of his career in this young season. He ends up with 11 free throws, were his career high as well. I think you had tweeted something about that. And so again, Wemby's having a great game. Well, guess what? Joel Embiid overshadowed his game and just every other player's game in the NBA with a historic 70-point night, which was a Sixers franchise record for a single game. It was also the most points a Spurs opponent has ever scored against San Antonio. So Embiid had just an incredible night there, historic night with those 70 points and he basically in not even a lot of minutes. So how did the Spurs do last week or these last 4 games? They Vegas said they go 0-4. They ended up surpassing that, going 1-3. And then what I really want to focus on too after this is after your thoughts is Wemby's last 11 games. He's really done a great job of scoring 20 plus points or more in 10 of those last 11 games. So let's just look at his averages right now in the last 11 games. And again, he's been on a minutes restriction during this point. So basically in 25 minutes a night, he's averaging 25 points, 53% shooting from the floor, 35% on threes, 87% from the free throw line. He's getting to the line 6.1 free throw attempts per game. He's collecting 8.6 rebounds. 3.5 blocks, and then lastly 3.1 assists to 2.8 turnovers. And again, these are in his last 11 games played. What are your thoughts on the Spurs recently in their last few games, and also Wemby specifically?
Yeah, quickly touching on Embiid 70 points real quick. The Spurs have been bailed out of some bad publicity this season. When they went on a franchise record losing streak, the Pistons were going on literally an NBA record losing streak, and I think that kind of bailed them out of the public perception. And last night, I thought that was going to happen too, because Cat had 53 points with 8 minutes left in the third. So I thought instead of Embiid scored 70 points on the Spurs, it was going to be like, oh, Embiid and Cat scored 70 points tonight, and Cat did tail off a little bit before the end. I think kind of just going backwards, starting with that game, I think that Zach Collins brings a lot to the table offensively. And I know that for whatever reason, and we appreciate everyone listening, we do have people who listen who are big Charles Bassey fans, as I've seen in the YouTube comments. And this one's for them when I say, I do think the Spurs miss Charles Bassey quite a bit right now. You can see it in their big rotation. The on-off splits right now with Wemby, when he checks out of the game, and I think he was a little bit better with Barlow, but neither Barlow nor Collins are near the defensive level that Wemby is. And Bassey isn't, 7'4", one of the best rim protecting prospects of all time, but he can hold his own on that end. And I think right now, if I'm looking at the Spurs rotation, it's that backup rim protector when Wemby, especially now that he's on a minutes limit. Well, hopefully he won't be for much longer based on some of the reporting we've heard. But when he comes out, it's a little bit easy to score on the Spurs inside. And we saw that last night. Obviously some of the scoring was on Wemby, but I think someone had the matchup stats for that game. It was I don't know, 12 or 16 points on Wemby of his 70, and so part of me does feel like that's kind of a big hole that they have right now in terms of every time he comes off the court, it feels like they're bleeding points to some degree. The other thing is this team is looking a lot better than they were in November and early December, which has been a very good thing to see. I think it's very difficult for people to really hold on to this thought process, but the Spurs have 8 wins. They're not getting to the play-in. So we just need to let go of wins and losses because at this point, it's about the development word. As I said, I realize that there's people that are going to be rolling their eyes when they hear that. But what we need to be looking for from this team is not, can they win 40 games by the end of the year? What was that, 2015 or 2016 when the Heat went 11-30 in their first 41 games and then 30-11 in their last? The Spurs aren't going to be doing that this year, as a little spoiler alert. But if you continue to see growth and you continue to see cohesion, I think that one of the big underestimated parts is all these players needed to learn how to play with Wemby, and Wemby needed to learn how to play with them. And this is touching on the point you talked about his last 11 games. I think something that's really stood out to me is every time you hear Wemby talk, Pop talks about his basketball IQ being so high. He talks about trying to play the game the right way and winning for his team and all that kind of stuff. I feel like he came in, and obviously he was great from the jump, but I almost feel like he was trying to be too accommodating to his teammates. I'm going to play the right way. I'm going to make sure that I'm passing at the right times. I'm going to make sure that Devin Vassell gets his and all that kind of stuff. And then when he went on his minutes limit, it was there was a shift in his brain where he realized I only have 24 minutes to go out there and do what I can do. And the aggressiveness just ramped it up quite a bit. And ever since that moment, he's been a different player, which is crazy because he was already good before that. But it's just he's taken a whole new step. And I think that took a while for him to get to that point because I think he's I'm the rookie. I want to be, accommodating of my teammates and all that. So that I think has been a big key to that. I also think the lineups have been, and this has been talked to death about in the Spurs discourse. But I do think, the other thing I had tweeted today that, is that Sohan's on-off numbers are looking great now that he's playing his natural position again. I think Sohan is such a confidence player. And when he has that confidence and when he has that moxie, he's able to do things on the court that maybe don't show up in the stat sheet, but he's really impacting the game. He's one of those guys that impacts the game sometimes without the stats. And I think we could all tell by watching him that his confidence wasn't necessarily in a healthy place when he was doing the point guard stuff. And now that Trey Jones is back, now that Trey Jones is in the starting lineup, like those numbers with Trey Jones, Sohan, and Wemby together in these last 11 games or in January are like amazing with those three on the court. So I feel like now that the positional stuff got, I understand the reasoning behind Sohan at point guard, and I understand the reasoning why you want to try Wemby at 4 at first. But now that those things have changed, this does look like an entirely different team, especially the starting lineup. I think now the biggest question is depth, especially with Branham falling out of the rotation a little bit. Keldon is their really quality depth piece, and Blake Wesley is becoming that, which I think is a surprise in terms of kind of where he was at Summer League and where he was at the beginning of the season. But so you're talking about like two solid rotation players off the bench, and none of them are bigs like we were talking about. And I think that's where you're starting to see some of this is where the rotation needs to be built upon. So that's kind of how I'm feeling. Honestly, you just want to see that growth. And since we're seeing that, it's hard to like really get too amped up about 1 and 3 when it's like I can actually see, like, because before, and we were talking about that on defense too, you just sit there going like, I think that was overhelping, but I don't know if they were trying to switch. I don't know if they were in drop. I don't know what's happening on defense. It was in, a lot of November. And now you can see like, oh, that player missed that coverage, or that player kind of blew what they were trying to do on defense. But I can see what's happening, and I can see them getting better. And that is such a difference from where it was 2 months ago. And I think that that's what we really need to hold on to and evaluate, because I think that's what's going to take this team from where they are this year to something more competitive as the years come.
Okay, yes, for sure. I agree with you there. I think I wanted to give you credit though for something you mentioned 2 weeks ago, was that fact about Wemby being on administration, how it's kind of lit that fire in him, where he knows he has to do as much as he can in those few minutes that he's out there. And I think that's one part of it's obviously also rotations, just getting more comfortable with his teammates. They're figuring him out. We see almost like 2 or 3 alley-oops a night now at this point from different teammates. But it's also like you said. I mean, he knows he's only in there for a certain amount of time. And then, after that, he has to, his time is over. So I think he was really taking that as precious time. And that's why we saw him as so aggressive lately. And I know that we're getting closer to him getting that minutes restriction lifted. I know there's been some reporting out there. Pop, as of Monday evening, he said, he doesn't know. The doctors will tell him when it's over. But again, I think we are getting closer to that point. And so I do wonder if he'll keep that aggressiveness up once there's like no set really number of minutes that he has to be out there on the court. And then, so you open up one door though, that when you started talking about like how their depth, how they missed Charles Bassey, and so that's like, what is the long-term plan with Zach Collins now? Because like that it doesn't work with Victor and Zach at the 4-5. It's it's Victor's best at the 5 we're seeing here, obviously. And then like we saw there off the bench, Zach's great at like moving the ball, things like that, getting kind of that quarterback of the second unit. He does a really good job of finding backdoor quotas, but they just gave him this big extension, not a big extension, what is it, like 17-18 million a year kind of range in the next two years. So what do you think might be long term with him? Just how you were mentioning how they might need some defensive help there at the backup 5.
Yeah, and they just gave him this extension in training camp because of so that I think that also goes to believe. Yeah, we talked about that in the preseason. I remember it was a podcast where Ben was on with us, and we talked about his extension. So that was in the preseason. So obviously they had very high hopes for him. I think maybe as you continue to bolster, as we're talking about the bench depth, right? If you get to a point where right now we're talking about again. Blake Wesley emerging as like a legitimately good player on defense off the bench. And then after that, the defense. So that was kind of the one thing you had with the way that the rotations were before, was like there was a mix of offense and defense on both lineups. And now it's like the starting lineup is great on defense, and the backups are pretty good on offense, but they don't have a lot of the defense going for them. And so if they were going to try to make it work out, maybe having like another point of attack defender on the bench, maybe another wing defender, like if they're trying to bring that in. But obviously there comes a point where, if Bassey was healthy, would he overtake him in the rotation? Because we've already seen this year that Pop isn't afraid to bring people in and out of the rotation as they need be. Like, these are draft picks from 1 year ago when we talk about Wesley and Branham, and a lot of the times when you're picked in the first round and you have like a lot of capital within your team, you don't just kind of flippantly go in and out of the rotation. But it's very clear that like Pop is willing to make these adjustments as he needs to. So I would be interested just to see if they like listen on him in the summer. I don't think they're going to do anything by the deadline because I do think
Yeah,
that
no, me either.
they need that big depth right now. But yeah, it would be, you know, Bassey's injury was a big bummer for a whole lot of reasons, but I would be interested right now to see if he would kind of be starting to absorb some of those minutes if he was still healthy.
Yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to mention, because I'm always, because you put a lot of good points out there in your discussions, and then, so I'm trying to like remember, because you mentioned some good stuff that I want to kind of recall. So one of the things you recalled was just, again, maybe not the wins and losses we're looking at. We're looking at the development, the growth. And I I'm a very, you know me, I'm a huge numbers guy. And just the fact that, yes, they fall behind by double digits and all this and that, but like, man, they really fight back. Like this latest team since like December onward, like they're really, they get back into ball games. I mean, you don't see these 30-point blowouts where they lose like by 36, 39. They really get these games down to 10, 15 points. You know, that's one sign of growth. And then just since Trey Jones became the starting point guard, I've been putting up these graphs online where, man, their second half performance has just skyrocketed. I mean, they're winning third quarters a lot more often. They're even competing there in the fourth, and so that's actually getting them back into ball games when they do fall behind pretty early. And obviously they haven't got off to the best of starts in some of these games, but I think that's also part of it, just that growth. And then even at the midway point, I tweeted the stats the other day I think it was on Sunday. Where, because you know the midway point officially came, and so I just kind of put all the numbers last year's team compared to this year's team, and man, almost in every category defensively there's some improvement. You know, it may not be great improvement, maybe like maybe like 25th compared to 30th, but there's some improvement in certain areas. And so I definitely think, like you said, we're gonna have to treat the season going forward more so as a development season. You know, those hopes for like a play-in team from the Spurs this year, that's got to be out, you know, out the window at this point. But I think that's something to watch, is just that development. Like you said, a guy like Sohan's just really taking his game to another level now that he's back there at the 4. Blake Wesley's been doing a great job off the bench. I know it's coming at the expense of Malachi Branham losing his minutes, but yeah, that's something to watch. And then, you know, if they end up finding trades for Cedi and Doug, then we get to see maybe a guy like Cedi Sissoko, what he can do out on the court. You know, those kind of players might start to get some run as the season ends. All right, so yeah, that was a really good discussion. Again, we'll kind of see what happens with Zach too, as I know that you brought that up. So that was a interesting discussions there. All right, I want to say thank you to Collin for taking the time to join me here on the Spurscast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review on YouTube and your favorite podcast apps. This episode was written, recorded, and produced by Paul Garcia. From all of us at Project Spurs, stay safe and have a great day.